of Android in an unusual way with the recent release of the new Anbernic RG DS, which is a dual-screen handheld very much inspired by the Nintendo DS, and because it has two screens, naturally I found myself wondering if the humble Rockchip RK3568, which is a new chipset here on the channel, would handle any kind of 3DS emulation. Believe it or not, I've never done a dedicated 3DS showcase before, so this is as much about exploring the possibilities of 3DS emulation with Azahar Plus on the RGDS as it is an opportunity for me to dive in deep, and believe me, we will have some pretty deep cuts here. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore the 3DS library on this $100 dual screen handheld, complete with our usual setup, install, and of course games showcase. So as always, before we begin, I just want to say that it's important to temper your expectations here, as the RGDS is powered by the Rockchip RK3568, and so this is a very underpowered chipset, and we are definitely pushing its capabilities, exploring any kind of 3DS emulation here. But that's part of the fun for me in this hobby, is to push these handhelds as far as we can go, and for someone that maybe only has the RGDS, as well as it being a cheaper dual screen handheld option, it's always fun to see if we can expand on the library of playable games, especially one with two screens that can accommodate the 3DS. Which surprisingly isn't as bad as I expected, despite the top screen having a different aspect ratio, since when the RGDS displays 3DS in its native aspect ratio, the viewable screen size is about the same as you would find on an original 3DS like you see here. And as a bonus, you do get a bigger bottom screen. Now most games on the 3DS didn't use the top and bottom screen in sync, which you saw more of over on the Nintendo DS. For example, in a game like Sonic Rush, so for the most part, this experiment actually turns out okay. And given that there are thousands of games on the 3DS, I figured we could find some fun ones somewhere in that pile that would work out. And so hopefully you discover some hidden gems and deep cuts in this showcase, which is definitely one of my favorite things to do here. Alright, so let's quickly get this set up and installed, and the nice thing is we can do this all right on the RGDS, and this device does come with Chromium out of the box, and so let's head on over and use that browser and navigate to the Azahar Plus GitHub, which for this video is the version of Azahar that I prefer to use since it's a fork of Azahar that does add back some features omitted from the mainline Azahar, which the big one being the support of 3DS format files. For those that like to use Obtainium, which lets you keep this updated automatically, you can see the source URL listed here, but for this video we will be doing a manual install. So let's head on over to the releases page, and the most recent release is from October 14th, which is version 2123.3-A, and I typically like to download the version that coexists with Azahar just in case you need to use the mainline version for any reason. So let's tap on that specific APK file, and then you will get a prompt that it's downloading, and just give it a few seconds and it should finish. Once it says file downloaded, just tap on open, and if you haven't already, you might get a prompt to allow unknown apps to install, which is a toggle in the settings. Once you've done that, you will get the same install prompt, and so let's go ahead and do just that. Okay, it shouldn't take too long, and once that's done installing, just tap on open, and now we can proceed with the initial setup of Azahar Plus, which should take you to the welcome screen. So tap on get started, and now we are on the permission screen. I personally select don't allow for the notification since I don't really want any of those on my handheld, but for the next two options, which is the microphone and camera, I typically select the while using app option since there are some games that might need both of those functions. So tap on next to proceed, and you might get another warning if you choose to not allow notifications. Just tap on skip to ignore it and move on. Okay, so now we need to point Azahar to the data folders, and if you don't have a user folder, no worries since Azahar will populate this automatically. But what I like to do is create a folder named 3DS, and then just point both the user folder and applications folder to this directory, which you can see is what I've done on screen here. The applications folder can be used as the location of any 3DS games that you might have that don't need to be installed. So games in the CCI or 3DS format can live here, and Azahar will automatically populate the home screen with the games you have in the applications folder, which in my case is just that same 3DS folder that I've created. So we're all done here, tap next, and then continue, and you should be on the main screen for Azahar Plus. You'll see that Azahar is scanning the directory and populating the games that I have in my 3DS folder. So let's quickly go over some settings which can be accessed by tapping on the 3 dots in the top left corner of the screen. First things first, very quickly, if you have games in a CIA format, you can install them from this screen by tapping on the Install CIA File option. You can also use this to install any updates or DLC you might have for a game. Okay, so let's select settings, and we can actually skip a few options here since, at least for the sake of this video, we don't need to modify a whole lot here. We can actually skip the general system and camera sections. The only thing I'd say to double check is that you have the new 3DS mode option enabled under system. With that, let's head into the gamepad section, which is where you can map your controls, and given that we are using an RG DS here, we do have built-in controls that we can map. It's fairly straightforward, just tap on the option and then press down on the button or input that you want to map. If you scroll all the way down, there's an option to map some hotkeys. And I do like mapping the swap screens and cycle layouts to the buttons in the analog sticks. So for example, the L3 and R3. The swap screens hotkey is definitely useful to have in case a game doesn't display correctly on the bottom screen when in game, which you can toggle easily with this. Okay, so let's now go into the graphics section. Here, I'd make sure that you are set to use Vulkan for the graphics API, and then go ahead and enable the first 3 options. So the SPIR-V shader generation, the disable SPIR-V optimizer, and the enable asynchronous shader compilation. We'll be leaving the internal resolution alone, which is the native 400 by 240 resolution, as well as linear filtering, which is enabled by default. The other option here to make sure is enabled is the disk shader cache. Now, under the stereoscopic section, I highly recommend to enable the disable right eye render option, which can improve performance for some games, but it can also break some games, and so throughout the showcase, I will let you know if any of the games I'm featuring needs this to be disabled. But as a default setting, I like to just keep this on, and then we kind of go from there. So we're all done here, and now we can go into the layout section, and given that we have 2 screens to work with, we do want to make sure we are utilizing both of the screens. Okay, so for the first option, make sure to set the screen orientation to landscape, and then for this landscape screen layout, select the single screen option. Now scroll down a little bit until we get to the secondary display screen layout, and for this setting, we will use the top screen option, and once that's done, we can leave everything else alone. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's an option to enable the performance overlay if you want to display things like the frame rate counter. So let's back out of here, and on this screen we do have the ability to download system files so that you get the 3DS home screen. Now that's completely optional, and so instead I'll just return to the main screen of Azahar. And one last thing I want to show here is that you can actually access a submenu by tapping and holding down on a game's icon, and a menu will pop up for that game with the ability to add cheats, add a shortcut to your Android home screen, and access the files directory for it. Okay, so let's go ahead and launch 80s Overdrive, and the first thing you're probably going to notice is that there's an overlay on screen. This is easy to toggle off by either pressing the dedicated back button for Android on the RGDS or swiping up to bring up the Android controls and then pressing back, which will bring up the sub menu on the left side. From here we can tap on the overlay options and then just simply toggle off the show controller overlay. Now going back to the game, you will notice that we have 2 of the same screens. This is also an easy fix, and the reason why I like having these swap screens hotkey mapped to either L3 or R3 is that we can change it on the fly by pressing it, so it's an easy fix if needed. You can also do the same thing from the submenu that we just talked about. And that's all there is to it, and we are now ready for what always seems like our larger than expected games showcase. And again, I will let you know throughout the video if there's a specific game that needs that disable right eye render option turned off. So we might as well start things out with 80s Overdrive, which is an awesome racing game that feels like it was designed in a time machine and sent straight to the 3DS. This is a retro-inspired arcade racer that pays homage to classics like Outrun, Top Gear, and Rad Racer, complete with neon visuals, pixel art sprites, and an absolutely killer synth soundtrack. As the one and only racing game entry for this showcase, it's a good thing that 80s Overdrive is a ton of fun, and it works quite well on the RGDS. Next up, we've got Attack of the Friday Monsters, and this is definitely one of those cult classic type of games on the 3DS. This is a short, story-driven adventure set in a small Japanese town during the 1970s, where monsters and superheroes from tokusatsu-style shows appear every Friday. Now, one look at the style of this game, and it's no surprise that Level 5 handled publishing duties for this, as it very much aligns with the type of games you would expect from the studio. Attack of the Friday Monsters is well worth exploring since it is on the shorter side and never wears out its welcome, but it is quite memorable. It also happens to be a full-blown 3DS exclusive, and one that works surprisingly well here on the RG DS. Azure striker Gunvolt is Inti Creates doing what they do best. Fast, precise 2D action with a ton of style. Now, if the gameplay looks and feels familiar, that's because the team behind this worked on Mega Man Zero, borrowing quite a bit of the gameplay from it. Gunvolt goes beyond just traditional shooting, and instead focuses on tagging enemies and chaining lightning attacks, with boss fights definitely being the standout here. The game blends tight mechanics with anime-inspired presentation and an incredible soundtrack. It's challenging without being frustrating, flashy without being overwhelming, and easily one of the best action platformers on the 3DS. The game has seen some sequels and spin-offs, including a direct sequel that is available for the 3DS, and should likewise work pretty well here with the RG DS. You will need to disable the Disable Right Eye render option for this game, otherwise the graphics will be glitched. Now, for something that is on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, we've got Corpse Party. This is a survival horror RPG that relies heavily on storytelling, atmosphere, and genuinely disturbing subject matter rather than flashy visuals. Corpse Party has been around for quite some time, with the very first game in the franchise releasing way back in 1996. The 3DS version is just one of many versions of the game available, but the 3DS version did add voice acting, enhanced visuals, and quality of life improvements, making it one of the better ways to experience the game. Unfortunately, the FMV sequences for this game are not full speed on the RG DS, but they don't make up a significant portion of the game. Dragon Ball Fusions is a very fun and interesting Dragon Ball game that changes things up a bit. Instead of traditional one-on-one fighting, this is a turn-based RPG built entirely around the idea of fusion. You can fuse almost any characters together, leading to some ridiculous, non-canon combinations that feel more like fanfiction brought to life. There's also a fairly solid character creation, so that you can bring your own Dragon Ball character to life here. Fusion's battles focus on positioning, timing, and chaining attacks rather than button mashing, which gives the combat a surprisingly tactical feel. The tone is lighthearted and the art style is playful with its chibi-inspired look. Fusions is definitely kinda weird, creative, and very different from most Dragon Ball games. This is another full-blown 3DS exclusive game and one that is well worth exploring. Etrian Odyssey Untold: The Millennium Girl is a modern reimagining of the original Etrian Odyssey from the Nintendo DS, and it's honestly one of the best introductions to the series. At its core, this is a classic first-person dungeon crawler that leans heavily into preparation, party composition, and definitely learning through failure. The dungeon exploration is slow and deliberate, with dangerous encounters that force you to think before every step. The ability to map out the labyrinths with the bottom screen adds a cool layer to this game that is uniquely only possible with the DS and 3DS. The Untold version adds a story-driven mode with fully voiced characters, making this version better than its original DS one. It also happens to run pretty well on the RGDS, and the only real issue, just like we saw with Corpse Party, is the FMV cutscenes that are not full speed, but it doesn't really take away from the game at all. For this showcase, I definitely had to dig a bit deeper to find some cool games that I was hopeful would work well here, and The Legend of Dark Witch is definitely one of those games. It's a fast-paced 2D action platformer that clearly takes inspiration from games like Mega Man, but adds its own twist with a magic-based combat system. Now, instead of just shooting enemies, you're collecting energy and deciding how to spend it, whether that's powering up your attacks or healing on the fly. It's a simple risk versus reward system that adds just enough strategy to keep things interesting without slowing the game down. It's quick, challenging, and very replayable, making it a great pick for shorter play sessions on a handheld device, and for the RGDS, this one works very well without any real issues. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time 3D is easily the highest profile and most loved game for this showcase, and to many still considered one of the greatest games ever made. The 3DS version is well worth exploring with its updated visuals, improved controls, and quality of life features that in many ways makes this the definitive version to play for most. I'm honestly shocked that this game runs at all here, and not only that, it runs a lot better than expected. And while it's not perfect by any means here, with some harsh dips in the frame rate, most likely due to shader compilation, this is a pleasant surprise for the very underpowered chipset in the RGDS. Again, I think this is awesome that the 3DS version of Ocarina of Time is quite playable here, which ends up being a great addition to your RGDS, and the more great games that are playable on this fairly inexpensive dual-screen device, the better. It goes without saying, if you haven't played Ocarina of Time, well, I think it's time, no pun intended. This also bodes well for Majora's Mask, which also received a 3DS version. And if you've hung out on the channel long enough, you know that I am quite the fan of Way Forward, and unfortunately I won't be featuring Shantae here since it's surprisingly a more demanding game than one might think. But thankfully, Way Forward had plenty of other gems, and Mighty Switch Force as well as its sequel Mighty Switch Force 2 are another set of gems that were originally released as 3DS exclusives for the eShop. These are fast-paced platformers that have a twist, and you play as Officer Patricia Wagon, who is able to flip switches in and out while rescuing hostages, which is where the game gets its name from. Now, it starts out simple, but quickly turns into a series of clever puzzle platforming challenges. I personally enjoy the second one just a little bit more because of the change from a blaster to a fire hose, which gives it an additional twist. Both games work surprisingly well on the RG DS and are well worth checking out regardless of where you play them. We've got another one of those higher profile franchises now with Persona Q, Shadow of the Labyrinth, which is such a fascinating crossover, blending the characters of Persona 3 and Persona 4 with the dungeon crawling mechanics of Etrian Odyssey, which we featured a little bit earlier. The result is a deep, turn-based RPG with tons of fan service and surprisingly, or maybe not so surprising, challenging gameplay. If you're a fan of either franchise, this one can't be missed. Persona Q also has the honor of being the first Persona game developed for a Nintendo platform first. And it's a good thing that it's an awesome experience, if a bit different for the Persona franchise specifically. The chibi art style is also very charming and the game just was well designed working to the 3DS's strengths. Now this one is definitely pushing the capabilities of the RG DS, and it's just one of those games that if you can accept some of the frame rate dips or occasional stutters that can happen with 3DS emulation, this one works well enough here, but it's definitely an example of where I wish we had just a little more power on hand for emulating a portion of the 3DS library. Now, speaking of games that make me wish we had a little more power on hand, Pocket Card Jockey is about the most random game concept that we will probably talk about for this showcase and possibly ever. Despite the performance not always being at full speed, I really wanted to include this game for the showcase just so that I can have an excuse to talk about it and show it off. Pocket Card Jockey is easily one of the most addictive games on the 3DS. It's a bizarre but brilliant mix of solitaire and horse racing, and created by none other than Game Freak. Part of what makes it so compelling is how the card gameplay directly affects the race outcomes, turning something simple into a surprisingly deep system. The growth mode, which is basically the story mode, is a lot of fun, and it's almost impossible to put this down once you get it going. As I said, this game is not at full speed for a good portion of the gameplay. But I don't think it matters all that much given the nature of the gameplay, and if you're at least curious about trying it out and don't have any other means, I'd say go for it. And it just so happens that we've got some more Game Freak games with easily the franchise that the studio is best known for, Pokemon. And specifically for this showcase, I'll be showing off Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Of course, no 3DS list would be complete without Pokemon, and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are awesome remakes of Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire from back on the Game Boy Advance. These titles modernize the Hoenn region with updated visuals, mechanics, and quality of life features while staying faithful to the originals. I'm actually surprised that these games run at all, and not only that, but run a lot better than expected, kind of like we got with Ocarina of Time. Now this is definitely not without compromises, and if you are wanting to try this out and play it on the RG DS, expect that you will see moments of pauses for shader compilation that is taxing the humble chipset here in the RG DS. Now there are a ton of other Pokemon games for the 3DS, and so I definitely say give the other ones a shot if you're curious. Puyo Puyo Tetris is one of my personal favorite puzzle style games, and in many ways one of the best puzzle games ever made, considering it combines two legendary franchises into one very polished package. The 3DS version never received an official English release, but I am enjoying this game with a fan translation, so that I can enjoy the very fun story mode available for Puyo Puyo Tetris. The game speaks for itself, but if you're in need of a puzzle fix, Puyo Puyo Tetris is a solid option, and one that works very well with the RG DS regardless of the amount of action on screen. Now speaking of puzzle games, back around the 3DS era there was a huge puzzle game that hit the mobile world known as Puzzles and Dragons. This game was a massive success. Seriously, it was the first mobile game to gross $1 billion in revenue. Puzzle and Dragons basically took the Match 3 puzzle concept but added the addition of an RPG progression system, monster collecting, and team building. Given the popularity and success, Puzzles and Dragons saw a lot of collaborations. But one that definitely stood out, especially for 3DS gamers, was the release of Puzzle and Dragons Super Mario Bros. Edition, which as you expect added the world of Super Mario to the game. The Mario Bros. Edition side of this compilation definitely stands out as the better game, which just adds a nice amount of polish, but also makes it great for newcomers to understand the mechanics, complete with the classic Mario overworld. And speaking of the overworld, the performance for that is a little bit slow, but it doesn't really matter, given it's just an overworld, and the gameplay itself is pretty solid, and a fun use of the larger bottom screen that we get on the RGDS. This is an awesome game to add to your library for fun pick up and play puzzling, and is an exclusive to the 3DS. We've got a few more RPGs to talk about here, and that's probably not too surprising given that a lot of RPGs are on the lighter side in terms of performance demands. Radiant Historia Perfect Chronology happens to be one of those games, and that's a good thing since it's often considered one of the best RPGs on the 3DS. The time travel based narrative, strategic turn-based combat, and mature storytelling definitely set it apart from more traditional JRPGs. The team behind this game was comprised of staff that worked on some pretty notable franchises like Shin Megami Tensei and Radiata Stories. Now this one doesn't surprise me that it runs pretty well on the RGDS since the 3DS version is actually an expanded remake of the original Nintendo DS game. But you know what, you might as well go for the expanded 3DS version, which adds more story and gameplay content. And outside of the DS and 3DS versions, this game remains exclusive to both of those handhelds, so it's well worth exploring regardless of which version you end up playing. Rune Factory 4 is actually the 6th game in the Rune Factory franchise, and so it's certainly a series that has been around, and if you're unfamiliar, it's a game that blends farming, crafting, dungeon crawling, and life simulation. Rune Factory is one of those games that once you get started, it's really hard to put down, and to many Rune Factory fans, the 4th game is definitely considered one of the better choices from the franchise. I believe this is the only Rune Factory game that was released on the 3DS, so it does make this a bit interesting for those looking into 3DS emulation, despite it being released on other platforms, including an updated version for the Switch. Rune Factory is a very lightweight game to run, and so it does fare very well here on the RGDS. I will say that the FMV cutscenes are not full speed like with some others that we saw earlier, but thankfully it's not all that essential to enjoy this game on the RGDS. We're not quite done with the RPGs, and next up we have a spin-off entry in one of the most iconic and long-running franchises, Shin Megami Tensei, but specifically Devil's Survivor Overclocked, which like Radiant Historia is an expanded version of the Nintendo DS game. This is a fantastic game that blends tactical RPG combat with the classic Megami Tensei themes and ends up being one of the best RPG experiences on the 3DS. The story drops you into a modern Tokyo under lockdown, where demons roam the streets and every decision you make affects who lives, dies, and how the story unfolds. The game was actually designed by veterans of the Grow Lancer series, so the tactical gameplay here isn't too surprising. The same can be said for the performance, and given the graphical style and its DS roots, it's not too surprising that this is another great option for those with the RGDS looking to expand their RPG library. Devil Survivor Overclocked is definitely the version to check out, as it does add a good amount of features, including an improved easy difficulty setting, which for me is a huge deal since this game can be quite challenging. One last thing, this game will need that disable right eye render option turned off, otherwise you're just going to get black screens when you start the game up. I feel like Shovel Knight needs very little introduction at this point, considering it's an indie darling and a masterclass in retro-inspired game design, blending NES-style platforming with modern sensibilities. It's also on nearly every platform known to man, and yes, this 3DS version is still interesting to check out because of the use of the bottom screen for things like inventory management, which is a pretty cool feature and makes this version stand out a little bit. Now, surprisingly and unfortunately, this game isn't always at full speed, and so take this one for what you will, and decide if that's something that you can live with. I will say that there are alternatives, including a relatively unknown native Android version of the game that was released exclusively for the Amazon App Store, and I've actually got a super old video about this specific subject here on the channel if you're curious about it. Anyways, I still want to show off this version of Shovel Knight since it is interesting because of the dual screen setup here. Now, another game I think that is well deserving of being up there with Shovel Knight is SteamWorld Dig, which is another indie darling that at first seems like a deceptively simple game that turns digging into one of the most satisfying gameplay loops you will ever experience. What starts as a basic mining game slowly evolves into a clever Metroidvania-style adventure. It was also the start of what would go on to become a fairly successful series with a sequel and some spin-off games, and so without a doubt was very popular and successful for its studio, image, and form. The game also happens to run quite well here on the RGDS, and so it's a nice win in my book for someone looking to experience one of the best indie experiences on the 3DS. And finally, we've got our last game on the list with Ultimate NES Remix, which is a celebration of classic NES games presented through fast-paced challenges and remixed objectives. It's basically a love letter to Nintendo's early years. The remix challenges are great since it keeps you on your toes and throws constant surprises, which keeps things fresh for the classic games that are represented here. This game is definitely a great fit for the RGDS with its short challenges, quick restarts, and constant variety that makes it perfect for pickup and play sessions. The performance is very good here with the RGDS as well, and so this is a fun and unique game that remains stuck on the 3DS and Wii U. And one last thing, like a few other games, you will want to make sure that Disable Right Eye Render option is turned off, since you will just get a black screen here if you try to play the game. And there you have it, we've reached the end of this showcase, and with that a surprisingly solid number of fun games that are pretty playable here with the RGDS in terms of 3DS emulation with Azahar. I think it's always fun to see how much we can squeeze out of hardware, and I think this is worth exploring if the RGDS is the only device you have in your collection. Now, will you be trying out 3DS on your RGDS? Let me know down in the comments section. And as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.